Hello and welcome back to AP World History. Today we're going to be on Unit 2.6, Environmental Consequences, specifically targeting in on the theme of human and the environment and the interaction. And our objective today is to explain the environmental effects of various networks of exchange in Afro-Eurasia from 1200 to 1450. All right, so we're going to do some skill practice at the end of class today, and of course, I will put a link on for this as well. It's another crash course. Oh, I guess I better find another one. Yeah, the existing pathway did not exist. There's a crash course that does cover. There's another John Green crash course that does cover this topic, so I'll make sure I have that link for you guys. All right, so looking at the environmental consequences during this time frame, and I'm going to guess you could probably take a shot in the dark and figure out what we're dealing with here. All right. So let's look at some of the big ones. Some of the bigger topics here. So things that get diffused out, and you can see Southeast Asia is kind of a big deal. In this story. And right, so from Southeast Asia comes the diversity of our diet, right? So a lot of the items that diversify the diet for people, especially things like vitamin C, or citrus fruits, right, come out of Southeast Asia. Of course, sugar will have a major impact for the next couple time periods. We start looking at the rise of sugar plantations and the such, right, and its impact. But we're also see coming out of Southeast Asia, right? Of course, we've talked about champa rice, right? Coming out of this champa region of what is today Vietnam, right? And diffusing up into China during the late Tang or early Song period. And the agricultural infrastructural investment we see is going to result in an increase in food supply, which then results in a population doubling during the Song Dynasty there, right? And so yes, we've talked about a decent bit of this, right? But we haven't really talked about those, the bubonic plague or the Black Death, right? So we'll gonna look at that today, right? And the diffusion of that coming out of Southeast Asia as well, and then eventually across the Silk Road, maybe. All right, so other kind of things going on environmentally and, forcing humans to react to them is, of course, the Little Ice Age. And I know I've mentioned this in an earlier video before. So after this period of warming that took place from about the mid 800s or early 900s, through about the 1200s or so. So after this warming period, right, this warm period we see in European history, at least, we see a global cool down take place. And you want to look for the causes of this. That I have seen assertions made that, the amount of dead as a result of the Mongols may have played a part in this. There's all kinds of assertions about why, but that doesn't, you can kind of play with, that goes beyond the scope of our course, right? And but what we do see is, right, there are effects of this that do matter to us here as well, right? So you are going to have a lot of crop issues, specifically in Europe, as a result of this cooling, shorter growing seasons, more rain, which are going to be really bad if you grow cereal grains as your way that you feed your population. Right, so yes, a Little Ice Age, you can kind of get a kind of a more zoomed in look at this here, and look at some of the famines, right? So there were a number of major famines that take place during this period. This one here is from Flanders. So Flanders is kind of northeast France through what would be the Netherlands today. Kind of in between those two areas, right? And so Belgium, right? Kind of Belgium and northeast France. All right, so we have a primary source account here, right? So from Abbot of St. Martin, and right, and we have what they believe to be the causes, and and the realities. All right. All right, and of course, we're going to see anytime you talk about famines in history, you're going to talk about peasant revolts. All right, so basically, there are truisms in world history. I don't know if I mentioned them on the videos or not, but I mentioned these in class. There are truisms in world history, right? So people are hungry, you're going to have revolts. So it's simply a truism. So this is definitely the case here that we're seeing in Flanders. Right, so series of small-scale peasant revolts. So you can read through this to get some evidence for yourself. All right, moving on. All right, so Black Death. Now, if we were in class, I am 100%. It's the plague, gonna kill you if you. I am 100% going to play that song. So if you are at home, you're free to walk to go ahead and Google Black Death, Holla Back Girl, right? And you can appreciate, you can enjoy that song as well. Okay. All right. So anyway, that being said, all right. So we talked about the Black Death, the plague, right? The bubonic plague. It's one of those things where, I guess we'll just kind of get right to it. So how does it spread? Okay, fleas, rats, all right, and we have here a believed to be transmission pathway, and this is according to a theory by historian William McNeill. Right, so this is his basic premise: is that you have an origin point in Southeast Asia, it gets diffused into China via tribute relationships. And then as a result of Pax Mongolica, right? As a result of Pax Mongolica, we will see the diffusion of it via the Silk Road, right? But I guess also not to be forgotten here, and maybe even a more likely transmission pathway is because of the intensification of trade that results as a result of Pax Mongolica. We're going to see much more demand in this region of the world for goods coming from this region of the world. And so transmission via ships is, also highly probable, right? So, but, the McNeill argument makes the Black Sea kind of Genoan trade connection from Pax Mongolia. As far as how it gets diffused into broader Europe when it does in the late 1640s, right? All right, so there's that kind of theory on this. There's also a divergent theory that I came across a few years ago, and this comes from not a historian, but from a Princeton University, I believe, a geneticist. And if I understood what I was reading, which I'm fully candid here, and I may not have fully understood this, but if I understood what I was reading, she was checking the DNA of the particular strands from mass grave sites found in, I think it was Egypt, but in Europe, or the Mediterranean regions. Let's leave it at that. The Mediterranean region. Get as specific as you know, right? And so she was checking the DNA strands, from mass grave sites in the Mediterranean region, and comparing that to some from China around that same time period. And what she was finding in her research is that there are two different strains of Yersinia pestis, right? So the McNeill theory has been challenged as a result of DNA. But I have not heard a lot of people talk about. I guess within the AP World History community that I'm a part of, I've never heard anyone talk about this. So I just don't know if it's not been generally accepted yet, or if there's work that counters it, which I have not seen. So, but anyway, this is even in stuff like this that are highly written about, there are still changes in how these things are perceived and our understanding of them. All right, so what do you need to take away from the Black Death or from the bubonic plague is, it's good to understand the fact that it gets diffused as a result of trade. All right, so the intensification of trade that happens as a result of the Mongols and Pax Mongolia will lead to the movement of these kinds of diseases. Right, so trade brings movement. Right, that's one of the big causes of this. Right, so increased trade, right, creates the preconditions for pandemics. We're also seeing a population increase, right, at this time in Europe because of that warming period that they're coming out of, right? So, and we're now decades into the better part of 100 years, I guess, into a kind of a downward slide with that. But the population was high, so which means urbanization, right? So urbanization had become a reality in Europe at this point. If you're talking about Europe, and of course in China, right, where it had always been present. Right, so see those kinds of causes, right, for this pandemic: increased urbanization, right, and transmission as a result of intensification of trade. So the preconditions for pandemics are definitely there. As far as effects, right, as far as outcomes or the effects of this, the death toll is high. Right? Death toll is very, very high. And of course, anytime you're ever talking about a pandemic, when you're talking about the death toll, you're talking about the people who actually die from the disease. You talk about, famine that happens as a result. What happens if the people who plant in any given region die, and who have the knowledge of planting, or, just whenever you have someone at any point of the food chain die, you're going to create a problem, right? And, this is one of these kind of realities of pandemics, is the actual disease is sometimes less deadly than the interruption of the food chain. Because once you start talking about interruption of the food chain, it's not simply people starving, but it's also the violence that will occur as a result of people needing food. So when we talk about the death tolls of this, it's multifold, right? So disease plus famine plus violence, bloodshed that happens as a result. And of course, there's also blaming, right? So, who brought this scourge upon the people? So there'll be a lot of blame, right, that goes around. So, and of course, the economic impacts of this are also devastating. So one of the things you're going to want to do is lock things down, and that's kind of a gut reaction. And we see this, right? We see this even here. And there's an old adage from Europe at this point amongst the upper class was, get away early, get away far, right, and stay long. So there's the economic implications of this are massive as well, which are then going to only contribute to this, right? So of course it's going to impact everything, right? It doesn't just impact people's lives and deaths and and the economics of it, but it's also going to have a massive impact on governance. The whole social order of Europe is going to be impacted by this. A lot of historians make the case that the reduction in population that occurs as a result of the bubonic plague will create a scenario in which people can now demand, their more money for their labor. And this right here creates the preconditions for the demise of feudalism, or serfdom, right? So it impacts the social order, and you're seeing here the artistic portrayals, right? Not what I would call a happy piece of art here, right? All right. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the population implications, right? So we see that population increasing during that medieval warming period. Some impacts maybe are slowing down as a result of Europe going into this little ice age, right? So there is definitely a slowdown that seems to be happening. right? And then the bottom falls out, right? So preconditions are there for pandemic. High population, urbanization, right? Intensification of trade, pandemic, right? And then get the eventually build back occurs. And you can kind of see there timing wise, right? You can kind of see it's going to take a long time, right? So 1347, 1348 is when it gets into Europe or into the Mediterranean world, and you're not going to see a true recovery for about 100 years. Right? So this is about a 100-year decline in the population in Europe. All right. Other implications of this are, the witch craze that takes place. But this is more of a long-term thing, right? So, as Europe just starts to rebound from this, so in the mid to late 1400s, that's when you're gonna see the witch craze taking off. That might make sense in a minute. And of course, this book is, becomes the kind of the guidebook of how to identify witches and how do you know someone is or is not a witch. Right. So this is going to be one of those things where, the preconditions are now there to target, right, groups of people. And there's also going to be something coming on the horizon as well called the Protestant Reformation. And we can see that countries that are Protestant generally see higher rates of witchcraft accusations. Okay, all right, so that's something we'll probably be talking about. And time permitting, I might actually watch a little clip from this in class. This is simply
It's a little price.
Commercial.
Thanks.
All right, so we'll probably watch a little bit of this in class, at least a minute or two of this in class. Simply, in generally in class, I will stop it and talk about the Aristotelian observation-based, right, claims that are made, and then supporting them with evidence, and that's generally how I kind of use that as more of a developing claims and using evidence than anything. All right. So that's that. And then we're gonna do a sourcing activity, right? And the sourcing activity is, if you click there, it's gonna bring you to my webpage. So this is our sourcing activity. So we're gonna source each of these, right? Each of these, I think there's four of these images in one way. So source this image. And I'm just going to run through these real quick with you guys, and show you how to read them. And then you can go to my website and do it yourself. So I guess I don't need to do this for every one of them. But all right, so this is the flagellants, right? So it is depicting flagellation, right? And it's from 1349, right? So it's or in 1349. All right, and so you have the text there that's been translated, in case you don't read Latin, right? So in the aforesaid year, right, 1349, it came to pass on the day of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin, some 200 people came here from Bruges. About noon, they remained assembled in the marketplace, and immediately the whole town was filled with curiosity as to why these folks had come. The burgesses came in small bodies to the marketplace when they heard the news in order to convince them of the fact by their own eyes. Meantime, the folk from Bruges, prepared to perform their ceremonies in what they called penance. Right? Penance. The inhabitants of both sexes, who had never before seen such a thing, began to imitate the actions of the strangers to torment themselves in a penitential exercise and to thank God for the means of penance, which seemed to them most effectual. And the people from Bruges remained in the town for the whole of the day and at night. So that's what that passage says, or the full passage says. Right, so this is our image. So source this in one way. Right, source this document in one way. And so you can source it for contextualization, document-specific contextualization or situation, who the intended audience of this piece of art is, what the purpose of this art is, and the point of view or what are the limitations of this particular source. And also, once you do that, that should be done in at least one sentence. And then take another sentence and do the so what of it. All right, so whatever the specific part of it is that you're identifying, give the so what for. All right, so that's that document. So source that one. Each of these should be 2 to 3 sentences. All right, so here's another source, burying of the dead. Right, illustrates the burial, right, and the victims. And since you are literally on this page watching this video, I don't need to kind of read all these for you. But there's nothing on the drop down here. Right, this is what we get. So, Burying of the Dead, published in 1342, depicting a scene of something that happened in 49. Right, so a couple years previous. Right, so Burying of the Dead. Our next document is The Culture of Death. All right, so 1463. All right, so notice our time frame here. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. All right. And then we have an inscription. Right, you can kind of see the inscription there that you can't read. All right, so we have an inscription at the bottom of the painting. Right, each living character addresses the skeletal figure, who in turn makes his reply. Here's an exchange. Right, so you're only going to get one of the exchanges between the Empress, who is here in red, right, and Death. Right, so talking to the skeletal figure. So there's the Empress. And then there's the reply from Death. All right, so there's that one. All right, and then lastly, this is the last one. In the Face of Catastrophe is the title here. All right, so and in the Face of Catastrophe, we've got four kind of focal points in this piece. Right, 3 of the focal points have passages. All right, so we have a translation for those. Right, so from the Christ figure, from the priest figure, and then from the death figure. All right, so I guess I can kind of zoom out a little bit. You can try to see all this in one image. Not quite there. All right, so that's most of it, right, in one view. Feel free to pause and go ahead and read that. All right, so that is your sourcing activity. All right, and stop this and go to the end. All right, let's skip over all those. All right, so that's it. All right, and so if you're at home doing this, please make sure you email your sourcing in one way for each of those 4 images. So I should get a total of, I guess 4 times 2 is 8, a minimum of 8 sentences. Right, so 2 sentence minimum, 3 sentence maximum for each of those 4 paintings. All right, so key takeaways from today. Intensification of interaction resulted in diversification of diet and introduced new staple crops. Right, enabling population growth and food stability. Remember, I actually did talk about that at the beginning. Negative, intensification of trade resulting in the introduction of new diseases, resulting in global epidemics, dare we, pandemics. All right, and how does the growth of interaction provide examples of continuity throughout history? All right, so using our scale of continuity or thinking about that. All right, that's it for today. Make sure you email me those responses if you are on distance learning today. All right, Sapriati.